Hello class, and welcome to the wonderful world of screencasts. In the first few of our screencasts, we'll be talking about secondary materials. And in this first one, I'm hoping to answer the question, why bother? The inclination of lots of students and new attorneys is to dive right into case research. And I am hopefully going to convince you that, especially if you are new to an area of law, you might want to start with secondary sources. So first, let's define our terms. What are secondary sources? I'm going to start with what secondary sources are not. And secondary sources, of course, are not primary sources, otherwise known as the law. What are primary sources or the law? Well, basically, those are what issued by the three branches of government. So we have the legislative branch that issues statutes or codes. The executive branch issues regulations which help interpret and enforce those statutes or code. And last but certainly not least, and probably your favorite, the judicial branch decides cases that you've been discussing throughout law school. Now, of course, this is a super brief review. We will be spending a large part of the semester going into far more detail about these primary sources. But now we understand what primary sources are. Let's go back to secondary sources. We know what secondary sources are not. What are they? Well, here are various types of secondary sources that will help us find and understand the primary sources of the primary sources, otherwise known as the law. So one type is legal encyclopedias, and again, this is a review of what you've learned in first year, just to refresh your memory and so that we're all on the same page. So legal encyclopedias are very brief. They cover all sorts of different topics, starting from abandoned property through the alphabet all the way till zoning. We have national encyclopedias such as American Jurisprudence or CJS, and then we have state-specific encyclopedias such as New York Jurisprudence. New York Jur, by the way, is a fabulous place to get started if you have a question regarding New York law. Another type of secondary source that you learned about in first year are restatements. Restatements, of course, are basic principles of the law in various different areas that are put together by experts in that area of law. Another type of secondary source that's kind of a hybrid is American Law Reports, or ALR. And it's kind of a hybrid because it's more in-depth than a legal encyclopedia, but it is still a fairly basic statement of the law. ALR is a great place to go if you find one on your topic, but because it's more in-depth, you won't find every single issue or topic covered by ALR. Law reviews you mostly know about. They are viewed as prescriptive. That is, the authors, usually a law professor, certainly one of your professors, is trying to convince you what the law should be. So in the process of making this argument of what the law should be, the author of a law review will usually tell you what the law is and explain it. So a law review can be a great place to both find and understand the law. And another type of secondary source is a treatise. A treatise is just a fancy word for a title, frequently a book, which can be online or in print, but a title that goes into a lot of depth on a very specific subject, and it's usually by an expert in that field. There are different types or flavors of treatises. You could have a scholarly treatise written by another one of your professors. You could have practitioner material. Practitioner material are designed to help lawyers in their day-to-day tasks, such as drafting forms, so you'll find sample forms, or checklists of what attorneys need to remember in a particular area of law. Another type of treatise is what I call all-in-one, also known in the print world as loose leaves, and it's what it sounds like. It pulls together explanation, it pulls together maybe some of these practitioner-oriented materials like forms and checklists. It might even include a scholarly discussion, and it might also include or link out to those all-important primary sources. Okay, so let's answer the question we first asked, why bother with secondary sources? Well, a short answer comes from a great article, Top 10 Things Law Librarians Wish New Associates Would Know. And this article is written by a law firm librarian who works with attorneys day to day, so has a very good sense of what attorneys need with regard to research. And the number 2 answer is to use secondary sources. Get some background on the issue before you dive in to do research online. Because these secondary sources, in addition to that background, will give you a context of the issue, some definitions, references to primary sources like cases, as well as giving you the big picture of your particular issue. So that's the short answer. So here we have this librarian telling you why secondary sources are so great. But what are they actually going to do for you? And we've answered that question already partially. They're going to provide you references to those all-important primary resources, statutes, cases, regulations. Secondary sources are also going to help explain those primary sources in regular old English, not legalese. So do you remember promissory estoppel from contracts in your first year? Do you remember exactly what that is and all of the different aspects regarding what promissory estoppel does? Well, if not, a secondary source is going to help explain that for you and what that crazy phrase means. Secondary sources will also identify potential issues. How many times have you run across an issue that has a 3-part test? So you need to know how to apply each of those 3 parts to the particular issue at hand. Secondary sources will identify terminology used. So in our promissory estoppel example, you're not really going to be able to research an issue regarding promissory estoppel if you don't know that phrase. So secondary sources will identify the necessary terminology you need to do your research. Secondary sources will give you an overall context of your issue and help explain the relationship between different types of primary sources or different primary sources generally. I'm sure you've run into 2 cases that seem to say the exact opposite things, or cases in statute that seem to conflict. Secondary sources will help explain those conflicts. And finally, secondary sources will help keep you up to date with regard to how your issue may have changed. Are there new cases? Are there new statutes? What are the new issues that have come about because of technology? Secondary sources will help keep you up to date with all of that regarding your issue. Okay, so hopefully I've started to convince you why secondary sources are so useful. When would you use them? Of course, an easy answer is to say throughout the research process. But let's get into more specifics. So at the beginning, I would recommend you would want to use secondary sources to get a basic introduction. And typically, encyclopedias and ALR are good for these basic introductions. That's not to say that they're the only good secondary sources at the beginning of your research. Sometimes treatises can be great there too. And it's not to say you would never use encyclopedias at other stages. This is just a general guide. In the middle of your research, you might want to follow up discovery of new legal questions, legal issues. You'll definitely want to find all the relevant primary authority. You'll want to get more in-depth treatment of your particular issue, and this is where treatises are particularly valuable. And at the end of your research, you want to make sure that you have all of the relevant primary authority. Again, you want to make sure that you are up to date with that primary authority and that you are aware of any developing areas. And this is what we librarians call current awareness resources. Okay, so we have talked about why you would want to use secondary sources, when you might want to use secondary sources, what they are. Let's talk about how to use them. And you can utilize these tools within secondary sources: index, table of contents, and keyword searching. Of course, index and table of contents are both in print and online tools that you can use. So let's first look at an index. So here is a print index, but again, you will find lots of indexes online. And let's see how you might use that. So if we were interested in the UCC, I might want to look at these particular topics, but I also have a reference here suggesting in addition to these topics, I could also see sales contracts. And all that means is I'd either click on S for sales or turn the page back in the book to S to look under sales contracts. Another aspect of the index is listed here under substituted agreement. Instead of see also, all I have is this C reference, so that means I'm not going to get anything unless I turn or click on D for discharge. And finally here, under this topic, unconscionability, again, I can go to very specific topics, but if I just want to learn about what on earth unconscionability is, the index is telling me that for a general explanation, I can go to page 380 and these wonderful words that I always love to see, et sec, which means and following. So I know that not only am I going to get a sentence or two on page 380, but I'm going to get several pages worth of explanation about what unconscionability is, starting on page 380. An index is going to be useful when you have a decent sense of what your terminology is or what it is that you want to research. So typically you'd use an index if you have more of an understanding of your topic. If you don't, then this is where one of my favorite tools come into play, and that's the table of contents. I think the table of contents is one of the more underappreciated tools in doing legal research. Why do I think that? Well, of course, the table of contents tells us what page you'll find a particular chapter on. We all know that. But what the table of contents also does is it starts to educate us about the different aspects of our topic. So here on this great treatise on contracts, I can see that an important aspect of contracts, as we learned in first year, is offer and acceptance. Also, consideration. Maybe I am interested in avoidance or reformation for misconduct or mistake, and I see here that different aspects of that subtopic might be duress or undue influence. Remember, we saw that in the index, or some of these other aspects, reformation, unconscionability. So if I want more detail about what's in Chapter 9, I go from the summary of contents to the detailed table of contents for Chapter 9, and I can learn within undue influence that it's related to the issue of duress. And then I can learn within undue influence there are elements. Maybe there's a 3-part test. So I have learned not only a little bit about what is in the overall area of contracts, I've learned what's within the sub-area of avoidance or reformation for misconduct or mistake, and I've learned even a little bit about undue influence and some related terminology like duress. So the table of contents, if you really don't know very much about an area, is a great place to go, again, to get the structure of the topic as well as also to get some of the important terminology. Okay, so we've talked about using the index, we've talked about using the table of contents. Let's talk about keyword searching. And here we're looking at Bloomberg, and it's really very straightforward. Starting here on the home page of Bloomberg, you can type in your keywords. So I'm using the example grandparent visitation. Or if I want to narrow specifically to secondary sources and then do a search, I can do that first by clicking here on the left and then doing a search. If I do a general search without narrowing first, then all I need to do at the next screen is just to filter. Here on Bloomberg, I would filter and choose one type of secondary source. And it pretty much works the same way on Lexis and Westlaw. So here on Lexis, again, I can enter my search terms in the search bar, or I could, if I wanted to, click first to narrow to secondary materials. If I just did a general keyword search, again, I would filter on the left to secondary materials. So our strategy is pretty much the same on Westlaw. You will notice that Westlaw is now blue, and they're now calling themselves Westlaw Edge. This is an update to Westlaw. The functionality is pretty much the same, but there are some new additions that we'll talk about throughout the semester. So again, our strategy is the same as Alexis and Bloomberg. So think about our jurisdiction. You can search all state and federal for secondary. Sometimes it's a good idea to narrow to a particular jurisdiction. You can go ahead and enter your keyword search at this first screen without narrowing at all. Or if you prefer, you can narrow and tell Westlaw you just want to search secondary sources. If you don't narrow first and you do your keyword search first, then you can filter to secondary sources after you've done your keyword search in your results, and you filter here on the left. When using secondary sources, you want to make sure to update, and update. You want to make sure to, absolutely positive, never forget to. Law changes every day. Cases are decided, statutes are amended, repealed, added. So you need to make sure you are advising your client on the current law. If I do my job well, then I will say this at least 1,000 times. Even if you're online, you can find materials that are way out of date. I'm sure you've gone to websites that were last updated in 2002. You can go on Lexis and Westlaw and find secondary sources that were last updated in 2008. If you want to use those, that can be fine. You just need to be aware that you need to do some other updating. Another thing you need to make sure to do when using secondary sources is to gather and read those primary source references. As an attorney, your client is paying you to understand and interpret the law, so you must read those primary sources. As great as secondary sources are, reading and understanding the primary sources is absolutely necessary. One thing to help you gather those primary source references can be a research log. Lexis and Westlaw and Bloomberg can help you do this with folders, or you can keep a separate research log. Another thing a research log can help you do is keep track if you get interrupted. Life happens. If you get interrupted, you may not get back to your research for a couple of weeks. You don't want to have to start over from scratch. Be really, really careful when you are using Lexis and Westlaw for secondary sources, because a lot of them can cost a whole lot of money if they are not in your organization's contract. There are tools on Lexis and Westlaw to warn you about this, and you definitely want to find out about that contract, and we'll talk a lot about this across the semester, but be aware secondary sources especially can cost a whole lot of money. So we have talked about what secondary sources are, why you want to use them, how and when you can use them, what you want to remember to do when you use them. Let's start to think about how to find secondary sources. We will actually talk about this in far more detail in the next couple of classes. Here are most of the techniques that we'll talk about, and we'll talk about these with regard to Lexis, Westlaw, and Bloomberg, as well as for the freely available web and other for fee databases in addition to Lexis, Westlaw, and Bloomberg. So what you want to look out for as you use secondary sources, you want to evaluate and think about, is it helping you? Or is it just mentioning your keyword terms but really talking about a different issue? Just because a secondary source mentions your keywords doesn't mean that it is actually discussing your particular issue. Don't get caught in wasting your time reading about something that's not your problem. If the secondary source isn't helping, is it the secondary source, or perhaps did you not classify the problem properly? An example of this might be our grandparent visitation example from earlier. Is the secondary source talking about grandparent visitation, or is it talking about child custody? You want to make sure that you have classified your problem and you are researching the correct issue. Grandparent visitation and child custody are very related, but they are also very different issues. And have you learned about new questions, or do you need to revise your existing question? Are there elements that you need to figure out how apply to your issue? Do you need to learn more about what best interests of a child means for our grandparent visitation example? So you may need to go back and research additional questions, or revise your initial questions that you didn't know about when you first started your research. Okay, so I need to ask you to remember to answer the screencast questions in our Lexis Classroom course website. You'll want to go to the Secondary Sources module, and then within the Secondary Sources module, you will find the screencast questions. That's the end for now. See you in class.